Museum Oral History Project. I'm interviewing Don Bingman at his house in Arvada, right? My name is Hannah Nordhaus, and it is September 15th, 2004. So let's get started. If you could just first tell me a little bit about your background, where you were born, schooling, what your parents did,
All
your
right.
life. Let's see.
I was born in Athens, Ohio, which is a small college town in southeastern Ohio, where I attended school there from 1st through 12th grade and also attended some university classes prior to my going into the military. I enlisted in the Army Air Corps. My father was a telegraph operator on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and worked there for a good many years through the Depression years. And when he wasn't working, because of having to be laid off occasionally, he became a career, also a Depression, I guess I'd say, house painter. And my mother was a housewife. When I got in the Air Force, I was assigned to Lowry Field here in Denver, and I was here until about 1940, November 46. During that time that I was stationed here, I met my future wife, and she's a native of Colorado from Longmont. And so when I was discharged from the service and went back to Ohio, I attended school for the spring semester and then returned to Denver, where we were married. And then I continued my education on University of Denver, where I got my degree in business administration, a Bachelor of Science. My wife continued to work while we were in school, and it's a good thing because that kept us in a little bit more food and groceries and pay the rent and a few things. Actually, then we started our family, or we didn't start our family until after I'd gotten through school. I graduated in December of '49 from Denver University, and immediately started to look for a job, and I ended up at Gates Rubber Company in the payroll department. My degree had been in industrial relations and personnel management, and there weren't many companies that really had a department like that at that particular point in history. So I had to take the next best thing I could get. But it worked out very well for me, because after a year and a half working at Gates, then I learned about Dow coming to Denver to build and to start up the Rocky Flats plant for the Atomic Energy Commission. I had a good friend who told me about Dow coming. His name was Bert Gregg. He later became he was a plant protection security guard there for a good many years at Rocky Flats. And he also obtained an application for me to get my hands on and take to the office for Dow at that time was the AA building at 13th and Glenarm in downtown Denver.
So you just heard through the grapevine that Dow was coming to open a plant.
Yeah.
Did you know anything about it?
I didn't know anything about it except that I thought it would be a good chance to make a little more money than I was making at the time. We were expecting a baby, and even though I was working as a supervisor at Gates, I didn't feel that we could live very long on the money, so I thought, well, here's a good chance to try to make a little more money. So I didn't really know too much about it until I applied for the job, but at that time I learned what it was going to be. It was going to be a weapons plant with contract with the Atomic Energy Commission.
And at that point, there were no buildings?
There was nothing out there at that point.
And you said that you were hired as which number?
Well, I was number 30 on the Dow payroll, and I know that that's true because I assigned the numbers. So.
So at the time that you started, were there any buildings?
There was nothing. Well, they had some guard shacks, they called them, that had temporary guard posts at Rocky Flats, where they were at that time, of course, keeping people out of the area. And they had started by digging some huge holes in the ground at Rocky Flats for the buildings. Shortly after I started, they had a family day at Rocky Flats. So the families of all the employees were able to go to the site and tour the site, which was nothing but a bunch of holes in the ground. And so that was the start of the Rocky Flats plant.
At that time, did your family know, or did your wife Ann know what you were going to do? What could you tell her?
Well, I could tell her what I was doing. Of course, I was hired to take care of the payroll department, but I was hired as an accounting clerk with the potential opening, of course, for a paymaster. And that's about all we knew about the job and the fact that it was a secret plant that was being built, and that we were not to talk about anything that we might have learned there about the production, the potential capabilities of the plant. So, and even at that point, I couldn't come home and discuss the number of people that were on the payroll, and as the payroll continued to grow, of course, and it did regularly, that number had to be kept quiet, and I couldn't even discuss that. So it was kind of a interesting thing to get into, where you had a job and you couldn't come home and discuss it with your family. But of course I was young and it was new, and I guess we learned to live with that.
So if you had a hard day of work, you'd come home and say, I had a hard day of work.
Yeah, I might have grumbled and mumbled a little bit about what I felt had happened to me, or I was put upon for some reason or another. But outside of that, well, I couldn't really discuss anything other than the fact I was working with payroll.
And what was it like being cleared to work at Rocky Flats? Was that a rigorous process? Well,
it really was. In those days, the clearance procedure involved the FBI. And the FBI, I found out later, had gone to Columbus, Ohio, to talk with my mother and dad who lived there, and I had a sister and brother who were living there, and their neighbors were interviewed. And then, of course, the neighbors in our where we lived were interviewed by the FBI, and her family was checked out in Longmont. And I don't know how much farther it went than that, but it probably was I think it was about 6 months, if I remember correctly, before I really got the clearance that I needed. Of course, at that time, there was not really too much to worry about. Right. and no secret documents, of course, in the area where I worked in the accounting department at that time that I ever saw or was had privilege to. My boss, of course, did, being the chief accountant. But I never learned about anything at all that was going on in those days. But I think it took about 6 months for the clearance to come through from the FBI.
So how did the work environment compare to Gates? Because that was your one previous job, right?
Well, I felt like the work environment was great at Rocky Flats. There were many young people, of course, who were being hired to perform the duties there at Rocky Flats. Most of the older people at that time were ones who had transferred maybe from the Dow Chemical Company or had transferred from Los Alamos to come to work at Rocky Flats. And they weren't all that much older. I was probably the youngest supervisor at Rocky Flats for a number of years. I was 20, let's see, I guess I was 23 or 24 years old when I started to work there. Everybody was older than me. So, but the work environment I thought was great. There were a lot of great people. I felt like they were some of the greatest people in the world that I was working with at the time. And everybody got along fine. Everybody had their sights set on the mission of the plant, and we went from there.
Did that work environment must have changed as it went from being a concept to reality, and as it grew, and over the years as sort of social change swept through?
Somewhat. I don't think it changed a whole lot for a number of years. I think it stayed pretty much the same, I would say, for at least the first 5 years, because production didn't start till about 1955, I think, 54 or 55. Mm-hmm. And so it was pretty much the same during that period of time, and I feel like that the camaraderie, I guess you'd call it, of the total plant continued on for many years.
How did the commencement of production change the environment?
Well, of course, then we were getting into changes in the production end, which involved craft people, and it was inevitable that unions would come into being at that time. I think the first group that dealt with the management at Rocky Flats was the Denver Metal Trades Council, which was a combination of a number of different craft unions in Denver. And I think even there again, the relationship between the management of the company and the union was great in those earlier days.
Mm-hmm. And then did that change?
I think over time, I think things began to change. In the first place, there was a move on the part of the union members to change unions from the Denver Metal Trades Group to United, I think it was United Mine Workers that came in next, and then further along, it changed from United Mine Workers to the steel workers.
And did you have much interaction with unions?
I did at first in payroll. There was some labor relations that was being conducted at that time, but I also was where anything was involved at all with pay. I usually was helping out to explain at least what we had, and knew what was being discussed, talked about as far as changes to the contracts.
Was that antagonistic in the?
No, I don't believe it was. I don't think that, I can't recall that it was at all.
So, and you had mentioned earlier that you did a lot of work with benefits and pensions and.
Yes, I was on a committee that was established to design and implement a pension plan for Rocky Flats. And that was very soon after I started. I think it was probably about 1954, 53 or 54 is when we first started working on that, and came up with a plan for Rocky Flats that required that you be 30 years old and have at least 2 years of service in order to become eligible for the plan. Well, of course, I was so young I wasn't even considered a member yet at that point. But yes, I worked on the original pension committee and establishing the plan.
And you had mentioned that there were some unique things that you did while at Rocky Flats around pensions, benefits, early retirement, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Well, I think the most interesting thing while I was still a paymaster at Rocky Flats was the continual change in the way we handled the payroll, from a handwritten payroll to completely computerized in 1964. And that was very interesting to me. I mean, the changes that took place during that period of time, which were pretty dramatic in some instances. The final change in the payroll system was when it was changed to a one-card payroll and cost collection system, and that was in 1964. And I might add that when I left in 1975, the same system was still in effect. They had modified it at that time. I don't know whether it changed with the later contractors or not. I have no idea.
Was that something that you had developed, or is that industry standard?
I was involved in the development of it. It wasn't really an industry-wide type of situation. I think even the Dow Chemical Company, some of the things we did with cost collection in the earlier days, and the methods that we used in order to establish a cost collection system, was of interest to them, and I was involved in some of those moves in the early days too.
You also mentioned that the union changed health plans, and that was a novel across Dow
Yeah.
as well.
In 1968, I think it was, the union negotiated with the company to establish a health care plan outside of the metropolitan life coverage, which had been with the Dow Chemical Company for a good many years. And in 1968, Blue Cross Blue Shield then took over the administration and the payment of health benefits for the production workers.
Why do you think it is that there are these sort of unique arrangements that were created at Rocky Flats that didn't exist elsewhere?
Well, I think we were pretty flexible at Rocky Flats. I think I believe from the administrative standpoint, we were very flexible and trying to meet the conditions that existed at a particular time, and made changes accordingly.
And why was that?
I really don't know, unless it was because of the management and because of the people that were working at Rocky Flats who were able to make these changes and to recommend and implement this type of administration.
You think it had something to do with the mission too, or the fact that it was sort of this federal contract? Or
Yes,
something like that?
I think probably one of the things that drove us to make some of these changes was the type of contract, and I've forgotten specifically just what type of contract they called it that we had, or Dow had with the Atomic Energy Commission in those days. I think it was a cost plus contract, but outside of that, I didn't get that involved with that particular contract to be able to explain it. I don't know.
So would cost plus have allowed Dow to be more generous with the people at Rocky Flats, and they might have been on one of their own, at one of their own plants where no one was guaranteeing their costs?
Not necessarily, because Dow felt like that even though we were working as a Dow division at Rocky Flats, even though we were working under contract to the government, they still wanted to handle the administration of pay and so forth the same as they would have handled it at any other division of the company. And there were times where negotiations became a little bit difficult, and part of the reason is that that Dow maintained they didn't want to step out and do something which might affect their own corporate practices and procedures and policies. So that did have a bearing in some of the later negotiations.
The union kind of stuff. So although Dow had more leeway in terms of profitability because the government was guaranteeing that they would cover their costs, they didn't want to set a precedent across company-wide that would be difficult down the line.
Yes, that's right. And they wanted to be able to live with themselves in the other areas of the company, and not have somebody point to Rocky Flats and say, well, see, this is what they're doing at Rocky Flats. They're leading the way in benefits or wages and so forth. And I think that was definitely involved.
But that said, there did seem to be a little bit more effort made to accommodate the wishes of the union, do you think, than in other places?
I think so. I really believe so.
So you left in 1975, and Dow pulled out. Did you leave when Dow left?
I left when Dow left.
And were you privy to the decision to leave, or were you aware of it?
Well, sort of. I knew some of the things that led up to it. And there were instances that the government was putting pressure on Dow to do certain things during a negotiating period that Dow said, we can't do that. We won't do it because it will affect our total operation. And it was then, I guess, because their contract was expiring, that the decision was made, as far as I know, at the corporate level, that they would not enter into another contract proceeding with the government.
Were you surprised?
No, not really. During those years that we're talking about, I could see more and more of a type of situation that probably led up to the final decision that they made. I wasn't privy to that information, but it was pretty obvious that some of the things that were occurring.
What were some of those things?
Well, I mean, it is mostly to do with interference on the part of the corporation's operating policies and procedures.
Government interference.
Yes, and inspired maybe by other groups.
The union, then, or?
Possibly.
Yeah. So this is like regulatory interference, oversight, or the the AEC interfering in union negotiations.
Well, they,
I've heard about.
yeah, they did do that. I believe that had a bearing, definitely, on Dow's final decision to not go ahead with the contract.
Okay. Maybe now, if we could, I took you off on another track. Let's just run through your career progression through Rocky Flats until 1975 when you left. So
okay.
that we have that history.
All right. Well, I had always wanted to work with employment and personnel, industrial relations, personnel management, and I felt that the payroll experience was great because I was involved in so many things that were going on at Rocky Flats, but it still wasn't quite the same thing as personnel work. And so I requested that I move into maybe into a beginning level again of personnel type work. Well, of course, they needed some help in salary administration, and I got involved in that, which I thought was very good because there were changes all through the years the early years that Dow was at Rocky Flats, changes in a number of things as far as the handling of employees in companies, as far as pay arrangements are concerned, like job evaluations and performance appraisals and this type of thing. And we got involved in that type of administration. And I was very happy to make a change into something that was a little bit different. I enjoyed the change. So I worked in salary administration for a while, and in the meantime, the company decided they wanted to take a look at an early retirement program for some of the salaried people who maybe had started early at Rocky Flats and were paid quite high, and they were trying to figure out ways to save costs and so forth. So we experimented with a small group of about 10 people to see whether it would make a difference in costs, and it made a considerable amount of difference when you took maybe people with years of experience and brought somebody in with much less experience on a job, because normally in salaried paying jobs, of course, experience counted a lot towards what kind of pay that they would receive. And so we did experiment with that, and the AEC felt like that was to their liking, and so then we had another program that was announced. I think it's in that letter that I showed you, that was open to any salaried employee that wanted to apply for it. Of course, they didn't have too many slots. I can't recall at this time how many, but there were a number of people who did apply for a chance to take early retirement with the supplemental benefits and with maybe a little additional life insurance and medical coverage during the time that they were, or prior to their 65th birthday. And it worked out quite well. That's the only time that I am aware of that was done in that manner at Rocky Flats.
And then?
Big pardon?
Then, was that where you finished your career?
Oh,
there?
no, then I was assigned to the benefits department as benefits manager, and of which I knew some about, but very little about the details of health care plans and life insurance programs and accidental death and dismemberment insurance and disability coverage, and as well as the pension plan as it existed at that time. So that was quite challenging to me for a few years, and I enjoyed it very much. And I got my feet wet. We tried to improve the payment, I think, like I mentioned to you, of claims paying and so forth. and found that one way to do it was to even approach insurance companies, which they weren't very pleased with anybody suggesting to them how an insurance plan operate. But with the help of the corporate Dow offices, why I was able to get Metropolitan Life Insurance to go along with very much a shortcut in claims payment, which made the hospitals happy and the doctors happy and the employees happy. So I felt like that was a nice accomplishment. Then I left the benefits department and went back into salary administration again, which in those few years that had transpired between my first experience of salary administration and my second experience, it had changed somewhat, and I enjoyed my work there again. I was working with about 1/3 of the salaried employees at Rocky Flats, and it was my responsibility to work with them on pay raises and on cash awards and on job performance and all that type of thing. So that was a very interesting experience for me. And overall, I had some very interesting experiences in administration, which could have been kind of a humdrum type of a situation, I guess. If you look back on it, probably there's a lot of people who say, what could happen in administration to make it interesting? Well, there were things there that I'm sure I was able to do that I couldn't have done anywhere else.
And again, why was that?
The management was open to suggestions and ideas and letting people kind of loose to do a job. Mm-hmm. And I was very happy with that.
So then when Dow left, they offered you a job in Michigan?
In Michigan.
And did you find that environment was very different when you went to work there?
Yes, it was. It was completely different because, of course, they were in the chemical business, and they had such a variety of chemicals that they were selling, manufacturing and selling. And I worked in the labor relations department there in job evaluation, where primarily my duty was to, if a union employee felt that he was not being paid sufficiently under the contract for the work that he was performing, they could call on the job evaluation department to come in and work with that person or study that person and make a determination of whether the job level should be up or not. If it went down, then of course the person wouldn't agree to that. But if it went up, they were happy to get that information, and decision was made whether to raise their pay or not. This was at the corporate Michigan division. And that was part of their union contract there. Mm-hmm. So that was enjoyable work as well.
And so what was different about the two environments in terms of?
Well, I felt like that actually the Dow corporate environment was very much centered around cost management. They had to, if they were going to be in a business and make some profits, they had to also watch their costs. And I think the pay arrangement, of course, is one of the biggest items you look at in a situation like that. And I thought it was very different. The safety requirements by Dow Chemical that were instilled in everybody at Rocky Flats were very valuable. I felt like the Dow Chemical Company had such a strong belief in safety that they insisted that that's the way we operate at Rocky Flats. Mm-hmm. I always felt like that was one of the best safety policies of anybody I'd heard of, any other company that I'd ever heard of.
And was that different in Michigan, or?
It was very much in existence in Michigan, but they They didn't, I felt like that they were a little looser in their interpretation of some of their safety requirements than we were at Rocky Flats.
And that was perhaps because the stakes weren't as
Yeah,
large.
yeah.
Interesting. So how long did you stay in Michigan then? So you were in Midland,
I was in Midland for 3 years.
and then you decided.
Yes, the main reason I left Dow was that the situation changed because, well, I think there was a downturn in business during the years that I was there, and it didn't work out quite to my satisfaction as to where I thought I should go or where I should be at that point. And an opportunity came up here in Denver to work at Adolph Coors Company, and it was something that was right down my alley as far as training was concerned. And I decided to early retire from Dow and to move to Coors as a brand new employee.
So tell me about the different what you found at Coors compared to working for Dow and working at Rocky Flats.
Well, I think there was definitely a difference. In the benefits area, though, we were able to accomplish some very, very significant changes at Coors, although Coors had many benefits that were equal to, or in some cases better than they were at Dow Chemical. But it was interesting to work with that. I worked a lot with the pension plans at Coors, and I established a pre-retirement planning program for employees out there that, in fact, it operated for the entire time I was there. I understand because of cost-cutting measures, they've cut that out now. But
And when did you retire for good?
I retired from Coors then in 1989, early retired. Then I worked for the AARP for a while as a volunteer in their retirement planning group. And I worked at Coors as a part-time employee working with the pre-retirement program. So I suppose that was about 5 years I did that after my retirement from Coors.
Okay, well, let's move on through this list a little bit. It sounds like you worked in building 111 for most of your career at Rocky Flats, is that right?
I'm trying to think about how long. I'd say my time was, well, actually I worked in building 111 when it was finished, and then the accounting and payroll department moved to building 81 when some of the production was phased out of building 81. And they made it available for administrative purposes on the lower level of building 81.
That's the one of the underground buildings?
Yeah, it's underground. Some people could hardly stand that because there were no windows or anything else, but I guess I usually had my nose to the grindstone that so much that I didn't pay any attention. So, but it was enjoyable. And then I moved from that back up to building 111. And that's where I entered the, salary administration was always in building 111. Well, it was until the last year or two. And then because of the expansion of the plant and space requirements, we moved into a trailer, a benefits trailer, along with the credit union. And that was very nice. It was a very nice office space. They were constantly remodeling Building 11, the configuration of the different offices and so forth, to try to accommodate the groups that were moving in and out of there and changes that were being made.
Did that remodeling reflect the priorities of the management as time went on?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, and also the expansion of some of the departments. That I've never been able to figure out how Rocky Flats employment jumped from about, I think when I left there it might have been 3,200, 3,300 people to somewhere over 6,000. I've never been able to.
After you left?
After I left, I've never been able to understand that, but it did happen.
Did production step up, or?
I don't know. I don't know what their reasons were, really. But
Must have been quite a job to manage all those salaries.
yeah, I imagine so.
So, did you have a favorite building, or, and I don't know, did you visit the other buildings? Were there ones that stood out?
As far as my own involvement in an office is concerned?
Or if you visit other buildings to look.
Well, actually, I think the office location that was probably the nicest of any that I can recall was the office that was built for accounting and payroll in Building 81. That was really, and for data processing. It was a spatial, data processing had for the first time a location for themselves. It was air conditioned and raised floors with cables underneath the floor, and everything was just about the way you would want it to be. So that was very nice, Building 81.
So you were there for 1957 fire and the 69 fire.
Yes.
And it sounds like you were in a working capacity where you probably had much interaction with the fires. I wonder if you could tell me your memory, if you have distinct memories of either of them.
Well, I remember the one in 57 because it was a pretty scary situation. There were about 3 employees that did breathe some of the contaminated, got some contamination in their lungs, I think. And I think they got such a big dose of contamination at that time that everybody was pretty worried about it. But they did provide, the AEC did provide all the best treatment that anyone could possibly think of. And to my knowledge, all 3 of the people survived, and even in some of the later years after I retired from Coors, I ran into one of the persons here in Arvada. He was involved in city affairs and politics and so forth. And I felt like that he was doing quite well. And I think he was one of the worst, that got some of the worst contamination at that time. So, but that 57 fire kind of, that kind of bothered me a little bit. And then in 69, of course, that was a huge situation there. But the people who cleaned up afterwards and were in charge handled the cleanup, I knew quite well. And I felt if anybody can do this right, they can. And I felt like that, I believe to this day, the stories, that there was just nothing released to the outside. And we were been accused of that. Well, I can get into that a little later, but.
Well, why don't we get into that?
Okay.
Since we're there.
I think, I really don't have a lot of respect for some of the anti-Rocky Flats proceedings and protesters and so forth. Because in the first place, I guess I would say, if they had really made a good study of what was going on out there and had paid attention to the information that was available if they wanted to check into it, then I would say, get a job. I just always felt like that. I felt like that they were unjustly accused of lots of things at Rocky Flats. That I mean, incompetence, and I never felt like that any of the people that, and as I said, I grew up with these people through those years at Rocky Flats, and they certainly were not going to be the type of people. They were serious about their mission and about the work they were doing, their inventions, and things that they built at Rocky Flats that had never been seen or heard of before in the world were at Rocky Flats. And I just could not believe that anybody could say that they're guilty of incompetence out there. And they were accused of that a lot of times in the production areas. That, oh, how did I get on that?
Oh, I asked you.
Oh, okay.
Well, why do you think that what the public did have this perception that Rocky Flats was unsafe?
Well, in the first place, it's even like we talked earlier, our families couldn't know everything that we knew about what was going on at Rocky Flats. And the public would know even less, I'm sure. And I think that may have been part of the problem, is the fact that it couldn't be told, some of the things that were going on out there. But then I think that I really feel like the news media had a lot to do with some of the disturbing things that were written about Rocky Flats. In fact, one time I called a TV channel when I saw they were talking about shipments from Rocky Flats, and when people were laying across the railroad tracks to prevent the cars, trains from moving and so forth. And they were talking about somebody in a rail yard downtown here that had laid across the tracks, but they were interviewing somebody at the gates of Rocky Flats out there. And I thought, you know, they're even presenting a picture that's not quite right here. And I don't feel like there was a lot of justice done by our news media.
Just because they're trying to make the story more compelling?
I don't know what the reasons would be. I think in this one article that I copied here, they quoted one of the news editors from the Rocky Mountain News as saying, "We make the news. We decide what's news."
So in terms of worker safety, you had mentioned earlier that Dow put a real premium on safety. Did you feel that was always the case? Were there ever any slip-ups or anything like that?
Well, we nearly set a record of 25 million man-hours. The disabling injury that prevented us from getting there was a person who hurt their finger with a screwdriver that slipped, and they later had to have surgery on that finger to repair it, so therefore it became a disabling injury. When you think about what we were handling out there, and the materials, and the type of work we were doing, and the chances for something to happen were very great, and nothing like that, well, I shouldn't say nothing like that ever happened, but very seldom did anything like that even happen at Rocky Flats. There was only one other company in the United States at the time that we were shooting for the 25 million man-hours, and that was DuPont, that had a better safety record among corporations than we had at Rocky Flats. That's how good we were. And we tried to maintain that through the years. Even in the offices, it was mandatory that we have a safety meeting at least once a month. And that you say, well, what can you find in an office? Well, we had to find things. We had to look for things that were hazards, such as file drawers that were accidentally would slide open on a file cabinet and let the whole cabinet come down on somebody. So we bolted all the cabinets together to keep that from happening. Electrical types of things, cords on the floors. It was amazing how every month we had to have a safety meeting. Well, we had one, and we discussed things that were pertinent to office people. and things that could happen. And like I said, the screwdriver slipping and injuring that person's finger, and later he had to have surgery done on the finger, that's the type of thing that can cause a disabling injury in a company, whether it's in an office or whether it's in production or wherever it is. I felt like their safety program was excellent.
So you mentioned that with the materials you were handling, it was especially important, the safety, and it was especially remarkable, the good job that was done. As the city grew up to Rocky Flats, did you continue to think that this was a good place to have a plant that handled radioactive materials?
Well, I began to wish through the years. I guess while I was out there, I felt like it was safe to work there. Safer than most places to work at Rocky Flats. And then after I left Rocky Flats and left Dow and thought about it for a few more years and heard some other stories that with contractors that followed Dow about some maybe a little bit of carelessness. Then I thought, am I listening to the news media, or did this really happen? And I don't know. But it makes you wonder. It made you wonder about it, and I'm now glad. I think it served its purpose. I think we did a great thing by in helping to prevent something disastrous with Russia, for example, who we knew what they were doing, and I think that we kind of blocked their interest in trying to do anything with the United States, and I think it served its mission. Did what it was supposed to do. Now I'm kind of glad to see it. I hate to see the place disappear for sentimental reasons, but on the other hand, I'm glad that it's being dismantled. And I think it's time for it.
When you, well, I guess how do you think that the site can be cleaned up to the level that they're saying?
Yes, I do. I feel like that. I was trying to think the last article I read where they were somebody who in charge of Rocky Flats now. I don't know whether it's DOD or ERDA or whether it's AEC. It's not AEC anymore.
DOE.
But as a DOE, okay, had made a statement. They ran down a list of things that had been checked and double checked and triple checked of people who had put out a warning saying that, well, we better be careful because there may be some things buried here, or there may be some things buried there, or maybe this was used as a dumping ground at some time or another. That every possible situation that they have heard of, or that they knew about or have heard of, that they have checked into and checked it out, and they feel like that everything is going according to plan and that it will be safe. And there's no doubt in my mind that it'll be safe. I was, even though I was in administration, I guess in my time at Rocky Flats, I was in all of the production buildings out there at one time or another because of a work requirement. I mean, because of something that involved my work with that particular department. And when I left there, as all employees that left Rocky Flats, one of the last things that you went through was a body counter that checked you for any type of radiation that might be within your body. And after 24 years, and all the years, like I say, I didn't work in the buildings, but I was around a lot of it, and there wasn't a sign of anything with me. And the body counter that they had at Rocky Flats was located in a lead-lined room. I don't know whether you ever knew about that. It was in a lead-lined room. Floors, ceilings, the whole thing was lined with lead to prevent any possibility of outside radiation getting into the reading on the personal body counter. And that was to prevent radiation that's natural in the soil and in the mountains and in the area that we live in. And it's interesting to note that that's the way they had to protect their readings from the outside environment.
Right.
And it's also interesting to note that a couple years ago, the United States gave Russia that same body counter that we had at Rocky Flats. And that meant they had never had anything like that in all of these years for their own people. And that was old. That was invented, that was designed and built by our scientists there at Rocky Flats years ago. That, I don't know, I really feel like that there's not going to be any harm to anybody if they make that into a park or put the museum out there or have hiking trails, whatever. I don't believe they would do it if they had the slightest idea that there would be anything there. I don't think they would be careless about that.
In some of the pictures you showed me, there's a picture of you with probably 7 or 8 women. And working in administration, I think you probably work with more women than most other people. I wonder if you could tell me how the environment changed for women and for minorities
Well,
that you saw.
the interesting thing is that most of the job opportunities for women when I started out there were in the offices. I mean, that was it. There was not an opportunity to work in production in the early years of Rocky Flats. However, as the years went by, more and more women protested to that and said, we want to be able to work in production as well. Well, the plant wasn't designed for with the safety requirements with women in mind. For example, they had showers in the production areas, all the production areas, where if by chance a person was contaminated, the first thing that they would do was try to wash or scrub the contamination off your skin. And the showers were not enclosed. They didn't have a shower curtain. They didn't have a shower stall. It was right out in the area where you get under there, and if you're not capable of pulling the handle on that shower, somebody else will. And get your clothes off and get you washed off or scrubbed. Well, that was one of the reasons the first manager out there, he was very concerned about women in the work area, the manufacturing area environment. And so much so that even some of the gals who worked in the manufacturing areas in some of their offices, he was even concerned about, I think at that time, and they didn't talk about it, about possibility of something sexual happening. Because Dow as a policy, even throughout the corporation, always felt like their offices should be subject to privacy, but with glassed-in offices. Everywhere you went, they're all glassed in. They were the same way at Rocky Flats. But it was a real challenge because they didn't have restrooms for women in the production areas. Just the shower and locker rooms where guys could go in, change their clothes, shower, and get ready to go home or put on their protective clothing on the way in or whatever. And I think he, for one, resisted that. That was the first manager. He resisted that quite a bit.
Okay, I'm going to stop you.
Oh, yeah?
Yep. So let me just change that. Hold on.
Yeah, so was that an hour?
This is Don Bingman. We're at his house in Arvada. It's September 15th, 2004, and I'm Hannah Nordhaus. And we were just talking about a very interesting conversation about women in the production areas, and that the first manager, Don was just saying that the first manager resisted bringing women in part because the buildings weren't designed that way, and it sounds like in part for other reasons. So I'll let you
okay.
go from there.
Well, that's my understanding of what took place in the first years, and why women were not permitted in the buildings is because they weren't designed to accommodate them and give them a sense of privacy. Mm-hmm. So when they did change their mind, then they had to go in and remodel and put in restrooms and make it possible. But there was one thing that could never be changed, and that is if it was necessary that you hit the showers, it didn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. You had to be willing to do that before you would get an assignment in any of those buildings.
And did you ever hear of that being a problem when?
I never heard of it ever being a problem. I don't know whether it was ever one or not. Probably somebody that works in the production areas might be able to enlighten you a little better, but I never heard of it ever being a problem.
And so did some of the women you work with move over to production?
There were, and I can't remember just exactly who, but there were some women who did move into the areas where they may not have worked directly with the production, but in an area where they'd be subject to some of the same types of problems. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there were. And
did they want to move in? Was the pay better in those areas? Was that
yes, it was. Yeah, the pay was better in there. They took into consideration what they were doing in that particular area, and I mean, of course, the more difficult, the more complex, and the more dangerous some of that work, why the pay was better.
So
now there were some women who worked in well, actually, I think I'm going to take credit for the first woman supervisor that I knew of who was working with statistics and was actually teaching statistics to many of the plant workers. Being able to get her job level raised to a level that was equal to anybody else in that particular line of work, I thought, gee, I think I was able to get that raised up there. So she was, I've always given myself credit for it anyway, that
you just saw that it.
And I think she did too. I think that she kind of gave me credit for helping her out.
And you did that just because you thought it wasn't fair for her not to be paid
the
same?
Right.
Was there any resistance to that?
There had been before, but I think I broke it down.
Did you, sounds like in the 60s and 70s, there were more minority people hired as well. Were there issues around that, and did you see that change happening while you were there?
Yes, and I think the thing that was noticeable about it that I didn't particularly feel was right was that I felt they were not completely looking at the person and what they had done and their past and so forth as they had with everybody else who had been checked out for security reasons earlier. And there were a number of people who I felt came to work out there that were really had to be questionable as far as security reasons from their past experience and where they found them and so forth.
And so they hired them because there was a real push to hire more minority applicants.
Yeah. I had an experience myself, even in the benefits department when I hired a person who was Hispanic. He'd worked in some of the production area in the plant, and I felt like that he really could do a good job for me in the benefits area. And we had a minority group at the plant that met occasionally to discuss the problems that were specific to their situation and their being minority, and lo and behold, I got a charge of discriminating against a minority. And I had to go before the group. I had to explain the situation and tell them what my side of it was and what my understanding of that particular situation that he brought up, what the situation was. And I came back that I was not guilty of such a thing. So then, that was the only time that I can think of that I really had to make a decision on what do I do now. And I thought I'm going to handle it the same way I would have handled it any other time. I said, it's important that we get along, and if you don't feel like that I'm the boss, then maybe you better look somewhere else. As long as you can recognize that and understand it, why, I don't think there'll be a problem. And several years later, when I went to work, I was working at Coors in their benefits department. One day the phone rang, and it was the same guy. And he was an employee relations manager for Rockwell in some other part of the country. And he said, I found out where you were, and he said, I just wanted to call and tell you, he said, that you're the best supervisor, he said, I ever had. And he said, I thought you ought to know that.
Oh, so nice.
So that was pretty neat.
Do you remember what the initial accusation was?
I can't recall now. I can't recall what it was. But he felt like it was discrimination. I can't really remember just what it was. But it was an interesting experience, and then particularly when it turned out the way it did. He has since passed away of a heart attack. I think he pushed himself so hard.
So just have a few sort of scattered follow-up, wrap-up questions. One thing I didn't ask you is what your memory was of, I guess you weren't working at Rocky Flats, but when you heard about the FBI raid in 1989, I was wondering if you could recall your response to that and what you think about it.
Well, I couldn't imagine what might have prompted that. I just had no idea. I don't know whether it was, I have no idea why that ever came about. I remember even when I was, you never know who may raise the question or may cause the FBI to come in and decide to handle an investigation. The first, gee whiz, I was in payroll 13 years, and then I was in salary administration a couple, 15 years before the this department handles the wage hour law. Investigator came to Rocky Flats. Well, because I had worked with the payroll for all those years and never had any problems, I guess I was selected to follow him around or be with him to help him while he was there. He was at Rocky Flats because somebody had complained. It said that they had been mistreated as far as overtime pay was concerned and so forth on a job. And I think it was only took one or two people to bring the investigator, Department of Labor, is where I was from. He was at Rocky Flats for a week, and he interviewed as many as 100 employees at random. And I was to line them up for appointments so that they could go in and be interviewed by this guy, and I had to stay out. Nobody from the company was allowed in the interview. And when all was said and done, he didn't have any, the charges were dropped because there was nothing specific or that they could really point to where we had gone wrong. And he went back several years, even into the years where I was still in the payroll. And I thought, oh boy, there's possibility there for an overtime slip up of some type, but there was never anything found. But I guess what I thought about is that it wouldn't have taken very much for somebody to get the FBI to come out there and take a look. And I have no idea what was going on or what they thought was going on that would involve the FBI. I don't know whether I guess it's as a result of that, though. That's when the decision was made to close Rocky Flats. I believe, if I remember correctly, that's the story. And if there was anything that serious, I guess that's the outcome.
So, just a couple more wrap-up questions. How did you feel about working in a plant that produced a key part of nuclear weapons?
I was proud to be there. I was proud of the role that we were playing, and it irritated me when I would read bad reports written about us and talked about us. But I was proud of what we were doing because I felt like that was about the only deterrent that I could think of to keep Russia was mainly our antagonist at that time, and keep them off our soil. So, in fact, I feel like that group of people at Rocky Flats were the best I've ever seen anywhere, and that I've ever worked with anywhere else. As a whole, their uprightness, honesty. I feel like it's the best group of people I ever worked with, and probably, of course, I hope I don't have to go back to work.
And I guess just one last question: what were the best and worst things about working there?
Oh, did I make a note on that? Well, like I was saying, I think that the seriousness of the Rocky Flats role and the high quality of the employees and the camaraderie of the total plant in performing that mission is the best thing. And the worst thing I can think of is having to listen to a lot of reports that I knew in most instances were not correct. It did something to you to hear that.
What did it do to you?
Well, it made you angry, because I felt like that if anybody knew what was going on out there, I felt like I did, although I didn't know everything that was taking place, because I wasn't privy to all of the most secret information that was being handled out there. I didn't know that, but I knew the people, and by knowing the people, I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. So that's what bothered me.
Well, do you have any more notes? Any other points that you
No,
want
I think that I've, by a roundabout course, I've covered just about everything I can think of here.
Great. Okay.
I want to thank you for listening to me.
Well, I thank you for participating
Okay.
and sharing your stories. Okay, I'll turn it off now. On and off.